The unexpected encounter. The night had a strange stillness, the kind that pressed on Amara's shoulders as she hurried down the cracked sidewalk. Her work uniform still clung to her from her 12-hour shift at the diner, carrying with it the faint smell of grease and coffee. She tugged her thin coat tighter around her frame, wishing it could shield her from more than just the biting wind, wishing it could shield her from the weight of exhaustion, the weight of bills waiting on her kitchen counter, the weight of life itself. Streetlights flickered above, throwing long, lonely shadows across the pavement. The city never really slept, yet at this hour it seemed caught between worlds, half awake, half dreaming. Cars hissed past in the distance, their headlights glowing like fleeting stars, and clusters of strangers moved with their own urgency, their faces hidden in scarves, their eyes downcast. Amara's breath clouded the air as she walked. She kept her pace brisk, her thoughts drifting to her small apartment, to the tea waiting in her cupboard, to the simple comfort of kicking off her shoes. But fate had other plans for her that night. It started as a murmur, a ripple in the rhythm of the street. People ahead of her slowed, voices rising in surprise. She frowned, squinting to see what had broken the monotony of the night. Then she spotted it, a man, tall and well-dressed, collapsing to the ground as though the life had drained right out of him. At first, Amara thought it was a stumble, a misstep on the uneven pavement. But when he didn't move, panic spread like fire. A small crowd began to gather. Some gasped, some pulled out their phones, others whispered in alarm. Yet no one bent down. No one acted. Her chest tightened. She could feel her heart hammering against her ribs. Why isn't anyone helping him? She pushed forward. "Excuse me, please, let me through," she said urgently, weaving through the frozen onlookers. Their eyes shifted to her, some with relief, others with doubt. A black woman in a diner uniform, tired and ordinary, what could she possibly do? But Amara didn't care about their stares. She dropped to her knees beside the man. His expensive suit, his polished shoes, the gold watch glinting under the streetlight, all of it meant nothing right now. He was pale, his chest barely rising. His breaths were shallow, uneven, fading. Her hands shook, but her training from that community first aid course years ago rose in her memory like a lifeline. She tilted his head back, checked his airway, and pressed her fingers to his neck for a pulse. Weak. So weak. "Someone call an ambulance," she shouted, her voice cutting through the murmurs. A woman fumbled with her phone. A man nodded nervously. But Amara didn't wait. She clasped her hands together and pressed down on his chest, 1, 2, 3, her movement steady, determined. She breathed into his mouth, praying each breath would pull him back from the edge. Time warped. Seconds dragged into eternities. She could hear her own pulse thundering in her ears, hear the silence of the crowd that now stood wide-eyed, watching her. For a moment, doubt whispered in her mind. What if I'm too late? What if I can't do this? But she pushed the fear away. She had to keep going. "Stay with me," she whispered under her breath as her hands pressed down again and again. "You're not leaving tonight." The man's body jerked slightly. A faint cough. Then another. Relief surged through her chest like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. His eyes fluttered, unfocused but alive. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone clapped. Another murmured, "She saved him." Amara exhaled, her own body trembling now from adrenaline. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, closer. The flashing red lights painted the street as paramedics rushed in, quickly taking over. They placed an oxygen mask over the man's face, checking his vitals, lifting him onto a stretcher. Amara sat back on the cold pavement, her knees weak. The paramedic looked at her with surprise and respect. "If you hadn't stepped in when you did, he might not have made it," he said firmly. She nodded, barely able to process it. Her hands still shook as she pressed them against her lap, trying to steady her racing heart. The man, whoever he was alive. That was enough. As the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle sped away, the crowd began to disperse. Some lingered, casting glances at Amara as though seeing her in a new light. Others whispered words she couldn't hear. But none of it mattered. She brushed the dirt off her knees, stood slowly, and continued her walk home as though nothing had happened. Except everything had. Because that night, without knowing it, Amara had saved not just a life, but a future that would soon collide with hers in ways she could never imagine. For now, though, she only felt the cool night air on her face, the lingering tremor in her hands, and a quiet whisper in her soul, sometimes, the most ordinary person can change the world with a single act of courage. The stranger's true identity. 3 days passed after that unforgettable night. Amara thought about it often, how a stranger's life had been hanging by a thread, how her hands had been the bridge between life and death. Yet she didn't dwell on it too long. She had no time. Life didn't pause just because you saved someone. Bills still waited on the kitchen counter, the landlord still knocked if rent was late, and the diner still demanded her time from sunrise to well past sunset. To her, it was just a moment. A powerful moment, yes, but just one of many struggles and small victories in her life. She had no idea that her world was about to be shaken. On a Thursday evening, the diner buzzed with its usual rhythm. Plates clattered, waitresses rushed between booths, and the hum of tired customers filled the air. Amara balanced 2 trays on her arms, weaving through the maze of tables with practiced ease. She had just set down a plate of pancakes for a young boy when a sudden hush fell over the diner. At first, she thought someone had dropped something, but the silence stretched, thick and unnatural. She looked up, confused, and saw what everyone else was staring at. A sleek, black luxury car had pulled up outside. Its glossy surface reflected the neon lights of the diner sign. Moments later, the door opened, and out stepped a man who seemed to carry the weight of another world. He wore a tailored navy suit, perfectly cut, the kind you only saw in magazines. His shoes gleamed. His posture radiated confidence, the kind born not from arrogance, but from being accustomed to power. Gasps rippled through the room. People leaned closer to whisper. Some fumbled to take pictures. Even the cook in the back peeked through the service window, wiping his hands on his apron. The man's eyes scanned the diner, sharp yet calm, before landing squarely on Amara. He began walking toward her with purposeful strides, and the room seemed to shrink around him. Amara froze, still holding her tray. Her heart thudded in her chest. Why is he looking at me? When he reached her, he stopped just a foot away and spoke in a voice low but clear, a voice that carried authority yet held an unfamiliar gentleness. "Excuse me," he said, his gaze steady, "are you the young woman who saved me on the street last week?" The tray in her hands wobbled slightly. The air in her lungs seemed to vanish. Every face in the diner turned toward her, eyes wide with disbelief. She stammered, heat rising in her cheeks. "Yes. That was me." A small smile touched his lips, the kind that softened the sharpness of his features. He extended his hand. "My name is Ethan Cole," he said. The name hit her like a thunderclap. She had heard it before, on the news, in headlines, in conversations about the rich and untouchable. Ethan Cole, the billionaire entrepreneur. Ethan Cole, the man who built a global empire of companies spanning technology, real estate, and finance. Ethan Cole, one of the most powerful men in the country. And she had saved him without even knowing it. Gasps spread like wildfire. A group of teenagers in the corner nearly squealed. A businessman at the counter muttered, "That's him. The Ethan Cole." Amara stood frozen, her fingers trembling as she shook his hand. She expected his grip to be cold, distant, the kind of handshake meant to remind you of your place. Instead, it was firm yet warm, filled with sincerity. "I owe you my life," Ethan said, his eyes locking with hers. "If it weren't for your courage that night, I wouldn't be standing here today." Amara's throat tightened. I I just did what anyone would have done, she whispered, though deep down she knew not everyone had stepped forward that night. Ethan shook his head gently. No. Most people froze. Most people waited. You acted. That makes all the difference. The diner, usually a noisy symphony of clinking glasses and chatter, had become a stage where every person was holding their breath, hanging on every word exchanged between them. Please, Ethan continued, lowering his voice so only she could hear, allow me to thank you properly. Dinner. Anywhere you'd like. Amara blinked in disbelief. Dinner? With you? His lips curved into a faint smile. Yes. With me. A burst of whispers filled the diner. Her co-workers gawked. One of the waitresses mouthed, say yes. With wide eyes. Amara hesitated. Everything about this felt surreal. She was a waitress scraping by on tips. He was a billionaire who could buy the whole block if he wanted. Their worlds didn't just differ, they were galaxies apart. Yet when she looked into his eyes, she didn't see a billionaire. She saw a man, grateful, sincere, and human. I don't know what to say, she admitted softly. Say yes, Ethan said simply. Because I'm not leaving until you do. A nervous laugh escaped her lips, and against every fear whispering in her mind, she nodded. All right. Yes. The corners of his eyes softened with relief, and for a fleeting second, he didn't look like a billionaire at all. He looked like a man who had just been given something far more valuable than money, hope. Tomorrow evening, he said. I'll pick you up. Before she could protest, before she could even process what had just happened, he pressed a card into her hand. A simple card. His name. A number. No fancy logos. Just direct and personal. Then, with the same quiet command he carried when he walked in, he turned and left. The luxury car door shut behind him, and the vehicle glided away into the night. The diner erupted into chaos the moment he was gone. Amara. That was Ethan Cole. You're going to dinner with him? Girl, do you realize who he is? Amara stood rooted to the spot, staring at the card in her hand, her mind a storm of disbelief. Her life had been nothing but routine, struggle, and survival. She had never been noticed, never been chosen, never been seen like that. And now, out of nowhere, the man whose name belonged to headlines and boardrooms had looked at her, the tired waitress, the ordinary woman, and said she had saved his life. She tucked the card into her pocket, her heart still racing. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. All she knew was that her life, once so predictable, had shifted in a way she couldn't yet comprehend. What Amara didn't realize then was that this was only the beginning. Because dinner with Ethan Cole would not just be a meal. It would be the first step into a world she had never dared to imagine, and the first step into a future that would change everything. An unlikely bond. The following evening, Amara stood in front of the small mirror in her apartment, fidgeting with the hem of her simple dress. It wasn't new, in fact, she had worn it to church once, years ago. She had pressed it carefully with the old iron she kept on top of her refrigerator, hoping it looked more presentable than it felt. Her reflection looked back at her with nervous eyes. What am I doing? She thought. She was a waitress from a struggling neighborhood. She didn't belong in the same sentence as Ethan Cole, let alone at the same dinner table. But then she remembered his words, the way he had looked at her in the diner, like she mattered. That thought gave her just enough courage to pick up her small purse and step out into the night. Outside, a sleek black car was already waiting. The driver, dressed in a sharp uniform, stepped out and opened the door for her. Amara hesitated, then slipped inside. The interior smelled faintly of leather and cedar. The city blurred past as the car glided smoothly through the streets. Her heart raced faster with every passing block. Where was he taking her? Would she embarrass herself? Would people stare? The car finally pulled up in front of a grand restaurant, its glowing entrance framed by golden lights. She had walked past places like this before but never dreamed of stepping inside. Her stomach fluttered with nerves. The driver opened her door, and there he was, Ethan Cole, waiting for her. He wasn't surrounded by bodyguards or assistants tonight. Just him, standing under the soft lights, his suit impeccably tailored, his expression warm. "You look beautiful," he said with a sincerity that made her cheeks flush. Amara laughed nervously. "This old thing. Thank you. But I think you might be exaggerating." "Not at all," Ethan replied, offering his arm. "Shall we?" They walked inside together. Heads turned instantly. Wealthy diners paused mid-conversation, some whispering, some raising their eyebrows. Amara felt their stares prickling against her skin. She wanted to shrink, to disappear. But Ethan didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't care. He pulled out her chair with a kind of old-fashioned respect, then sat across from her. The menu was placed before her, filled with dishes she couldn't even pronounce. She stared at it, her hands clammy, until Ethan leaned forward with a reassuring smile. "Don't worry about the menu," he said gently. "Order whatever feels right. And if nothing feels right, I'll choose for us." Relieved, Amara nodded. "Maybe you should choose. I don't exactly fit in here." His expression softened. "Amara, you fit in anywhere you choose to be. Don't ever let anyone make you feel otherwise." Something in his voice silenced her nerves, at least for a moment. As the evening unfolded, conversation flowed more easily than she expected. He asked about her life, not the kind of shallow questions she was used to, but real ones. "What was it like growing up where you did? What do you dream of, Amara?" She found herself telling him about her childhood in a small, tight-knit community. About her mother, who had worked tirelessly to keep food on the table. About her younger brother, who had big dreams but no resources. About her own dream, to one day finish college and open a community center for kids, a safe place where they could learn, play, and find opportunities she had never had. Ethan listened intently, his eyes never leaving hers. He didn't interrupt, didn't judge, didn't dismiss her words as unrealistic. Instead, he leaned in closer, as if every word she spoke mattered. "You're extraordinary," he said softly when she finished. Amara blinked in surprise. "Extraordinary? I'm a waitress who barely pays rent on time." He shook his head. "You're extraordinary because despite everything, you still dream. You still want to give back. That kind of heart is rare." For a moment, silence stretched between them. But it wasn't awkward. It was powerful, filled with something unspoken. Then, gently, she asked, "What about you? You're Ethan Cole. You have everything. What do you dream of?" His expression shifted, shadows flickering across his face. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "I have everything money can buy," he admitted. "But that doesn't mean I have everything. People see the billionaire, the success, the empire. What they don't see is how lonely it can be. How hard it is to trust anyone when everyone wants something from you." His voice grew quieter. "The night you saved me, you didn't know who I was. You didn't hesitate. You didn't care about my money, my reputation. You only cared that I was alive. Do you know how rare that is, Amara?" Her chest tightened. For the first time, she saw not the billionaire in front of her, but the man behind the name, a man who carried burdens few could understand. "I didn't do anything special," she whispered. "You did everything," he replied firmly. The rest of the dinner passed in a rhythm that felt strangely natural, as though they had known each other far longer than a few short days. They laughed over small things, shared stories, and found comfort in the honesty between them. When the plates were cleared and the night grew late, Ethan walked her outside. The city sparkled around them, but Amara barely noticed. "Thank you," he said, his voice rich with sincerity. Not just for saving my life, but for tonight. For being real in a world where that's so rare. Amara smiled, her nerves replaced with something else, something warm, something new. Thank you for seeing me, she replied softly. For a long moment, they stood in silence, two worlds colliding under the city lights. She was still just Amara, the diner waitress. He was still Ethan Cole, the billionaire. Yet somehow, in that moment, they weren't so different. They were just two souls, unexpectedly connected by one night, one act of courage, and one dinner that would change everything. A world she never imagined. For days after their dinner, Amara's life felt like it was moving in two directions at once. On one side, nothing had changed, she still woke early to catch the bus, still tied her apron at the diner, still counted tips at night and worried if they would be enough. But on the other side, something new was blooming. A door had cracked open into a world she never thought she'd touch, and it was Ethan Cole who was holding it open for her. The following weekend, Ethan invited her to see his world, not the polished version in magazines, but his life behind the headlines. Amara hesitated at first, unsure if she belonged anywhere near that kind of wealth. But curiosity, and something deeper she couldn't name, pushed her to say yes. When his car arrived at her neighborhood, it looked like something out of a dream. The black sedan gleamed under the afternoon sun, out of place on the cracked pavement lined with modest homes and corner stores. Children playing on the sidewalk paused, staring wide-eyed. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, whispering. Ethan stepped out, dressed simply in a shirt and blazer, yet he carried himself with a presence that turned heads. He smiled when he saw her waiting by her door. "Ready?" he asked. "As ready as I'll ever be," she said with a nervous laugh. The car carried them away, and soon the scenery changed. The worn buildings of her neighborhood gave way to towering skyscrapers of glass and steel. Streets lined with boutique stores, luxury cars gliding past, people in tailored suits walking briskly with phones pressed to their ears. It was a world that seemed to operate on a different clock, a faster rhythm. Amara pressed her face lightly against the window, her eyes wide. "This doesn't even feel like the same city," she whispered. Ethan glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "That's because it isn't. Wealth builds walls, Amara. On one side, people live with more than they can spend. On the other side, people fight just to make it to tomorrow. And the truth is, most of the time, those worlds never touch." She turned to him, surprised by his honesty. "And yet, here we are." A faint smile tugged at his lips. "Here we are." The car finally stopped in front of a sleek building that seemed to stretch into the clouds. The doorman greeted Ethan with a respectful nod as they walked inside, the marble floors gleaming under chandeliers that sparkled like stars. Amara's footsteps echoed softly, her nerves growing with each step. When the elevator doors opened to the top floor, she was greeted by a view that stole her breath. Ethan's penthouse looked out over the entire city, glass walls opening to a skyline that glittered in the daylight. The living room was vast, decorated with modern art and furniture that looked like it belonged in a gallery. She stood frozen near the window, taking it all in. "This is unreal." Ethan stepped beside her, slipping his hands into his pockets. "It looks impressive. But sometimes, all this space just feels empty." His words caught her off guard. She turned to study him, and for the first time she saw it, the loneliness hidden beneath his polished exterior. They sat down, and slowly, their conversation unfolded. Ethan told her about his empire, how he had built it piece by piece, starting young, pushing harder than anyone else. How success had come quickly, but so had the isolation. "When people see me, they don't see Ethan," he admitted quietly. "They see the billionaire. They see what I can give them. Business partners, investors, even friends, most of them don't care about me. Just what I'm worth." Amara listened intently, her heart heavy. She had never thought about how wealth could be a prison. "That must feel suffocating," she said softly. It is, he confessed. That's why that night meant so much to me. You didn't know who I was. You didn't want anything. You just acted. She lowered her gaze, her fingers nervously tracing the seam of her jeans. I didn't do it for recognition. I just couldn't stand there and watch. That's exactly why it matters, Ethan said firmly. For a long moment, silence filled the room, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence where two people realized they were beginning to understand each other. Then Amara shared her own truth. She told him about her struggles, working double shifts, sending part of her paycheck to help her mother, barely keeping herself afloat. She admitted the weight of her unfulfilled dream, to finish her education, to open a community center where kids from her neighborhood could find hope instead of trouble. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but she didn't stop. I know it sounds foolish, she said finally. But I can't let go of that dream. Even if it feels impossible. Ethan's eyes softened as he leaned closer. It doesn't sound foolish at all. It sounds brave. Amara looked at him, startled. Brave? Yes, he said firmly. Because dreaming when the world tells you not to, that takes strength most people don't have. Something inside her shifted at his words. For years she had buried her dreams under the weight of survival, ashamed to even speak them out loud. Yet here was a man who lived in a world beyond imagination, telling her her dreams weren't small, they were powerful. The hours slipped away unnoticed as they talked. They shared laughter, too, stories from childhood, little quirks, moments of joy hidden between the struggles. For the first time in a long while, Amara felt seen, not as a waitress, not as a struggling woman, but as herself. And for the first time, Ethan felt like more than a billionaire. He was just a man, opening his heart to someone who didn't care about his wealth, only about his humanity. When the evening came to a close, Ethan walked her to the car again. They stood for a moment at the entrance of the glittering tower, the city lights reflecting in their eyes. Thank you for trusting me enough to step into my world, he said quietly. Amara smiled faintly. Thank you for letting me see the man, not the billionaire. As the car pulled away, Amara looked back at the skyline, her heart conflicted. She was still the same woman with bills waiting on her kitchen counter. But she had touched a world she never imagined, and more importantly, she had touched the heart of a man who had everything, and yet, nothing. And though she didn't know it yet, their worlds colliding was only the beginning of a journey that would test them both in ways neither could have foreseen. Challenges and doubts. For a while, life felt almost magical. Amara found herself swept into moments she never imagined, walking beside Ethan through city streets, sharing laughter over late-night coffee, sitting in his car as they talked for hours about life. He never treated her as anything less than equal, and for the first time in years, she felt truly valued. But the world around them wasn't so kind. The whispers began almost immediately. The tabloids caught a photograph of them leaving the restaurant after their first dinner together. Within days, headlines screamed. Billionaire Ethan Cole spotted with mystery woman, who is she? From waitress to heiress? Ethan's new flame raises questions. Is this love or just another scandal? Amara's face, once invisible in a crowd, was now plastered across websites and gossip columns. Strangers dissected her life, her clothes, her background. Some laughed at her, calling her a gold digger. Others sneered, saying she was reaching above her place. At the diner, where she had always been just another waitress, things changed too. Some co-workers were supportive, whispering excitedly behind her back, telling her how lucky she was. But others weren't so kind. Don't forget us little people when you're living in a mansion, one waitress said with a smirk. Another rolled her eyes. Come on, Amara. Be honest. You're not really into him. You just see dollar signs. The words stung, even though she tried to brush them off. Every time she walked through the diner now, she felt eyes following her, judging her. At night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, questions swirling in her mind. What if they're right? What if people think I'm only with him for his money? What if I don't belong in his world at all? Ethan noticed the shift in her. One evening, as they sat in his penthouse watching the city lights, he reached for her hand. "You're quieter lately," he said gently. Amara hesitated, her eyes fixed on the skyline. "Do you ever wonder what people say about us?" He frowned. "I don't care what people say. But I do," she admitted softly. Her voice trembled as she continued, "Everywhere I go, I feel like people are staring at me, judging me. They think I'm with you for your money, Ethan. And sometimes I wonder if they're right. Maybe I don't deserve to be here. Maybe I don't deserve you." Her words broke the air like glass shattering. Ethan turned toward her, his expression fierce. "Amara," he said firmly, his voice cutting through her doubts, "the night you saved me, you didn't know who I was. You didn't ask for anything. You didn't hesitate. Do you know how rare that is? You're not here because of my money. You're here because of you, your heart, your courage, your kindness. And that's worth more than everything I own." Tears welled in her eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. "It's just hard. Your world and mine, they're so different. I feel like I don't belong in either one anymore." Ethan squeezed her hand. "Then let's stop thinking about what world we belong to. Let's make our own." His words sank deep into her soul, a promise she wanted to believe in. But still, the doubts lingered. Not everyone in Ethan's circle was pleased about her presence. At a charity gala he invited her to, Amara experienced the sharp edge of judgment firsthand. The ballroom was dazzling, crystal chandeliers, waiters carrying trays of champagne, guests dressed in gowns and tuxedos worth more than her yearly salary. Amara wore a simple second-hand dress she had done her best to tailor. She thought it looked decent, until she caught the way some women whispered and smirked when she passed by. "Who is she?" one voice murmured, not quietly enough. "Probably just another phase," another replied with a laugh. At the dinner table, one of Ethan's associates leaned toward him with a forced smile. "Ethan, always surprising us. You've certainly brought interesting company tonight." His eyes flicked to Amara, dismissive and condescending. Ethan's jaw tightened. "This is Amara," he said proudly. "She's the reason I'm standing here today." The man chuckled lightly, as if it were a joke, before changing the subject. But Amara felt the sting in her chest. She excused herself to the restroom, staring at her reflection in the mirror. For the first time in her life, she wished she could disappear. When she returned, Ethan noticed her forced smile, the way her shoulders sagged. After the event, he didn't wait for her to speak. He took her hands in his and said quietly, "I know tonight was hard. But don't let their shallow words break you. They don't know you. I do. And I'm not going anywhere." His unwavering support was her anchor. Each time the world tried to pull her down, he reminded her of the truth, that their bond was real, no matter what others said. Yet Amara couldn't help but wonder how long they could withstand the storm. Every day seemed to bring new challenges, new doubts. She was fighting not just for herself, but for their relationship. One night, as she lay in bed, her mother called. The warmth in her mother's voice gave her strength. "Baby, I've been hearing things," her mother said gently. "People talking about you and this billionaire. I want you to remember something, you don't owe anyone an explanation. You don't need to prove yourself to the world. Just stay true to who you are. That's enough." Those words became a balm to her soul. Amara began to realize that challenges weren't meant to push her away from Ethan, they were meant to test how much they both were willing to fight for each other. And every time she looked into Ethan's eyes, every time he stood by her side against the whispers, she knew the answer. They were willing to fight. Together. Because what they shared was not built on wealth, or appearances, or the approval of others. It was built on a moment of courage in the street, a spark of humanity that had ignited into something neither of them expected. And though the road ahead would not be easy, Amara was beginning to understand one powerful truth: sometimes, the hardest battles lead to the strongest bonds. A future forever changed. The city skyline stretched endlessly before them, glittering with thousands of lights. But Amara wasn't looking at the city that night, she was looking at Ethan. The man she had met by chance on an ordinary street, the man whose life she had unknowingly saved, the man who now held her hand like she was his entire world. It was surreal to think back to that moment, the day she knelt beside a stranger, pressing against his chest, praying he would breathe again. At the time, she never thought it would lead here. She had only acted out of instinct, out of kindness, out of the values her mother had instilled in her, to help, even when it wasn't easy. Now, her life had shifted in ways she could never have imagined. But change never came without challenges. They had weathered the whispers, the stares, the hurtful words. There were moments when she doubted herself, when she wanted to retreat back into the comfort of her old life where no one paid her any attention. Yet every time, Ethan's hand reached for hers, steady and sure, reminding her that she wasn't alone in this battle. One evening, as they walked by the waterfront, Ethan stopped and turned to her. His eyes carried a seriousness she hadn't seen before. "Amara," he said softly, "I've spent years building companies, attending meetings, running after numbers. But none of it ever gave me peace. Not until you. You've taught me that life is about people, about love, about the small moments that matter. And I don't ever want to lose that." Her breath caught as he slowly reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small box. Her heart skipped. Opening it, he revealed a delicate ring, sparkling under the city lights. "Amara, I don't care what the world says. I don't care about the whispers, the judgment, the differences in our worlds. All I care about is you. Will you marry me?" Tears flooded her eyes before she could stop them. For a moment, she couldn't speak. She thought about the girl she used to be, the one who worked double shifts at the diner, who carried bills in her bag and worry in her heart, who never dreamed of a life beyond survival. And now, here she was, being asked to share her life with a man who had everything, but wanted her above it all. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, Ethan. 1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring on her finger, and the world seemed to stop for a heartbeat. The city around them faded, the noise drowned out, leaving only the two of them, two souls who had found each other in the most unexpected way. But the story didn't end there. Their engagement became a headline, of course. The media buzzed, some celebrating their love, others criticizing it. But Amara no longer carried the same fear she once did. She had learned that people would always talk, always judge. What mattered was the truth she and Ethan carried in their hearts. Soon after, Ethan did something that completely changed not just Amara's life, but the lives of many others. He created a foundation in her name, the Amara Foundation, dedicated to helping underprivileged women pursue education, healthcare, and opportunities. "This is inspired by you," Ethan told her during the opening ceremony. "Because the woman who saved me didn't just change my life, she reminded me that true wealth lies in giving, in lifting others. And I want the world to see that." Amara stood on that stage, surrounded by flashing cameras, but for once she didn't feel small. She felt proud. She had gone from being the girl nobody noticed, the one serving coffee and wiping tables, to being a woman who inspired change. Not because she sought the spotlight, but because she had simply chosen to care when it mattered most. Her mother cried that day, holding her close and whispering, "You see, baby. God doesn't waste kindness. One act of love can open doors you never thought possible." The wedding, when it came, was both breathtaking and intimate. Ethan spared no expense, but Amara insisted on something simple, something real. She walked down the aisle in a gown that shimmered softly, her heart racing as Ethan waited at the altar with tears in his eyes. The vows they exchanged were not about wealth or status, but about love, trust, and standing together no matter the storm. As they kissed, applause thundered around them, but Amara only heard the sound of her own heart, steady and full. From then on, their journey continued, not perfect, not without its share of struggles, but deeply rooted in love. Ethan continued his work, but with a new sense of purpose. Amara became deeply involved in the foundation, traveling, speaking, and mentoring young women who reminded her of herself. Women who thought their lives had limits, until someone showed them otherwise. She never forgot where she came from. Sometimes, she returned to the diner just to sit in the corner booth with a cup of coffee, watching life unfold around her. It reminded her of how far she had come, and how one choice, one act of courage, had rewritten her story. People often asked her, "Did you ever imagine this would be your life?" And she always smiled gently and answered, "No. But I've learned something important: the smallest act of kindness can ripple into the greatest blessings. You never know whose life you might change, or how it might change yours in return." Her story spread, not as a fairy tale of riches and glamour, but as a powerful reminder of humanity, of fate, of the extraordinary hidden in ordinary days. Years later, as she stood with Ethan on the balcony of their home, watching the sunset, he wrapped his arm around her and whispered, "You saved me that night, Amara. But what you really did, was give me a reason to live." She leaned against him, her heart full, and whispered back, "And you showed me that I was never meant to live small. Together, we made something bigger than both of us." And in that quiet, golden moment, Amara realized the truth of her journey. Sometimes the future doesn't come from chasing after dreams, but from living with love, courage, and kindness. Because one simple act, a stranger kneeling on the street to save a man, had become the seed of a love that changed her life forever.